right, everybody. So today, back on the podcast, we have Dr. Stu Phillips. How we doing, man?
Hey, good. How are you doing, Dave?
I am good. So, we were just talking about we had you on the podcast. It might be, I think, three times total. Last time you and Lane were on the podcast, and it's funny because over the years, you follow people, maybe unfollow people, and you're somebody who I've actually followed from the beginning, certainly the beginning of this podcast, but even well before that. And I think you have been somebody who people see as very knowledgeable on like a few key topics, but also I would say trustworthy source of information. You do find that certain people, it's like, hey, they'll maybe post something controversial to get a following, and I think you just kind of had a steady like, hey, this is what the info is, and this is how it should, well, how you interpret it, which is generally pretty good interpretation. So I just appreciate that it's been like an even keeled, good information for a long time.
I appreciate that. That's how I'd like to be known. Even keel, good information.
Yeah, 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 yeah. So I know obviously like protein is very in your wheelhouse, but there was actually a different topic I wanted to bring up, and this is I think what made me first reach out was you had made a post, and I should find it and include it later on, but you had made a post about a lot of misguided ideas on hypertrophy. And one of the things that you had said was that you said no serious researcher considers metabolites to be hypertrophic. Do you
Right.
remember that post generally?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
And I would just like to expand on that because that is
Yeah.
something that, metabolite training and the idea
Sure.
of all of that is often talked about. So maybe you could
Right.
elaborate on that.
Yeah. So I'll sort of I'll trace this back to I think some of the I'll call it the origin of a lot of theories in hypertrophy that stem from the observed difference between how power lifters and bodybuilders, well, they how they look, and then how they perform as well. So, uh, bodybuilders, a lot of volume. You test them as a 1RM compared to, say, a power lifter, and they're a lot weaker. And that led to one of the, I think, biggest red herrings that's out there is the idea that there's a different type of hypertrophy with bodybuilders that they gain sarcoplasm. So they called it sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, which again, Mike Robertson, Brad Schoenfeld, and I have bashed back and forwards on Twitter, on X, whatever you call it these
Yeah,
days.
yeah, yeah.
Um, and I think we can all agree that it's probably small if it exists. We've tried to find it. We don't see any evidence of it, but Mike Roberts' group has done some good work in the area. And again, maybe it's there. If it is, it's transient. Or if you do see it, you see it in guys who are admittedly steroid users, and there is some sort of expansion of the fiber that appears to be non-myofibrillar, so we'll call it sarcoplasmic. But one of the other things is that arose from a similar type of observation, of course, is that if you're doing lots of volume like that, then you're building up lots of metabolites, and that explains the hypertrophy, because the theory at the time was that everything was load driven. Is that loads were the key part, and again, like, that theory's been busted wide open now, and sort of load, yes, to a certain extent, but volume and proximity to, I'll call it, momentary muscular failure is a bigger driver of growth than load per se. So if you can get growth with 20% of 1 RM, which is, it's a pretty light load. It's not, it's
Hmm.
not, it's not picking up and lowering a pencil for sure. So there is something that you have to do
Yeah.
load wise. Then it really suggests that load's not a big deal. But the idea is that the metabolites that accumulate intracellularly are somehow turning on processes of hypertrophy. And one of the observations is always, the track and field events that result in some of the greatest lactates I've ever seen. So 400, 800, 1500 meters, and even the 3000, 5000 meter guys and women have lactates that are far higher than you would see at the end of a resistance training workout. And yet,
Right, right.
they're not huge individuals. 400 meter runners, big guys, 800, not quite as big. 1,500, 3,000, 5,000. They're small people,
Yeah.
uh, but no muscle growth.
All
So,
right.
and that I guess that kind of sums it up in in a
Yeah,
little
yeah.
bit of a nutshell. But
So back up a little bit for people who maybe aren't aware. So like I remember even when I was getting into this, and there was this talk about, okay, there's myofibrillar hypertrophy and sarcoplasmic hypertrophy.
yeah,
And I mean,
yeah,
some even presented it as if it was 50-50. You could do heavy loads, and that's the
yeah,
myofibrillar, and the sarcoplasmic, that's the pump, the metabolites, and that's
sure.
why the bodybuilders have these full muscles. And I mean, it was like a whole thing.
Yep.
And so you're saying that basically we don't see that. If it exists, it's very minimal.
Yeah, I mean, even like some of the extreme volume studies that are out there, and Cody Hahn did one when he was with Mike Roberts as a PhD student, and like an extraordinarily high number of sets, sort of 50 plus sets per week per body part. And when you look at the responders in that study, they tend to get a bigger gap between myofibrils within the myofiber. So that's the sarcoplasm, or I'll just call it non-myofibrillar, so non-force generating. And but it's very small, and that's only really in the guys who responded to that type of training. So it's not the 50-50, or it's not even a large proportion. And part of the point I make to people is to talk about, interatomic distances within a cell. So when you begin to swell the fiber, and if 50% of the fiber were not contractile tissue, it would be a thermodynamic disaster to try and get ATP to the site that you would use it. And I know that's
Mm.
getting right into the nitty gritty, but
Yeah, yeah,
if you do the calculations, it's a diabolical problem. It would, bodybuilders they'd fall over. They do one or two or three reps, and then,
yeah, yeah,
the diffusion distances would be so great that it just wouldn't happen. So it may be there. And when I think, not to put words in Mike's mouth, but Mike Roberts is sort of the idea that that expansion kind of primes the muscle for a little bit of growth. And it could be even that the mitochondria respond to that to generate energy to kind of, respond to a little bit of a crisis. So I'm not saying it's not there, but if it is there, it's generally, I think it's transient and relatively small. So it's definitely not the bodybuilder's fibers fill up with, I'll say water for lack of
yeah.
a better word, but non-contractile protein or yeah, space.
Were
It's
you
just not
saying
there.
he was saying it's possible that it is almost a step before the myofibrillar hypertrophy occurs? You said it's almost like preparing for that
Yeah.
next growth.
Yeah, he calls it sort of priming, and I think if you took muscle biopsies, or if you had animals that you took the muscles from, maybe at the right spaces in the training program, or during some big volume periodization, that you could see something like that. But it's even in his hands, it's a relatively small, and maybe I think if I'm interpreting what he's saying correctly, short-lived phenomenon. In other words, it primes the system, and then the system kind of backfills in with the contractile proteins. So, and Troy Hornberger is another guy who, and this guy, he lives and breathes this stuff. And he and his PhD student Kent Jorgensen and I wrote a really, I mean, those guys did the majority of the work, and Kent drew some amazing figures for a review paper. And we looked really hard for this, and in conclusion, all of the evidence that this existed was really from cross-sectional studies where guys were taking, admittedly, very high doses of steroids, and
Mm.
then you begin to see things that I think are not the norm.
Right, right, right. Sure. Um, yeah, it's interesting. So if you were to take, these classic examples you'll see in articles and whatnot, and you'll say, hey, here's this power lifter who's this size, and this bodybuilder that's this size, and maybe the power lifter is so much stronger, but the bodybuilder is bigger.
Right?
Somebody came to me, I said, well, one, obviously there's a huge genetic component to that, right? Of like,
Sure,
your
sure.
strength relative to size, obviously. Two,
Right.
there's a neurological adaptation, right? So
Massive.
just by
Yep.
constantly doing powerlifting training, you're going to
Sure.
be far stronger.
Mhm.
Do you think that that's just the bulk of it when you see the difference in those two individuals?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, I don't spend as much time in gyms as I used to. Do
Yeah.
more training at home than I ever did. But uh, um, when you go to gyms and you watch powerlifters train, I mean, it's like 2 reps, three maybe at some point would be the extent that they would do in a big lift, and a lot of warm up, a lot of prep, a lot of wrap, smelling salts, the whole routine for one big lift. And that's not how bodybuilders train at all. So I think that there's in fact, a very refined neurological component to a power lift that, this talks to muscles and it fires motor units all at once. And, the best power lifters, they probably have the greatest synchrony of motor unit firing to get
Yeah.
that weight off the ground or off their chest or whatever. And antagonist muscles I doubt whether they're completely switched off, but the idea is that they're not impeding, the agonist muscles during the action. So, all of that stuff, I think if you began to get a bodybuilder and, train them a little bit more in that fashion of lifting, they would get much better, obviously. So I think there's a neural component. Is it 100% neural? I don't know that I can say, but I think that's a large part of it. And to your point, skill, which you can argue neural, and then probably, yeah, some sort of genetic predisposition and a little bit of choice, right? I think all of us tend to do things that we're good at.
Hmm.
And maybe at some point in life, people figure out that, I can get pretty big, but I'm not as strong as that guy. And so you focus on this, and the guy who's stronger or the woman who's stronger, like that's his or her thing. So,
Totally.
but
Yeah, it's something I
yeah,
talk about on the channel all the time is, people will say, "Oh, well, look at this person doing this." And it's like, well, yes, well, people gravitate towards what they're good at. You
sure.
get positive reinforcement. And not even just lifting, anything in life. It's a balance between how much work do I have to put into this
Sure.
and how big is the payoff relative to what I was expecting, and that is going to drive
Yeah.
most of your decisions.
Yeah, yeah, I think in not just in the gym, but in life, and probably what it is that we choose to do as well. And I'm not saying that hard journeys, choosing to do something that's difficult, isn't worth it, or in the end, sometimes the journey is obviously what shapes you and creates you. But
Sure.
we tend to slide towards things that we're good at or better at. And yeah, so.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, just an example in lifting, if you look at like Eric Helms and Lane Noren, right?
Mm,
Lane Noren, good bodybuilder, really
sure.
good power lifter, right? And
Yeah,
decided that's what he's going to go with.
yeah.
Eric Helms, decent power lifter, but very good bodybuilder now, and
Yeah.
he's even said like that's what he's going to lean towards. And I
Yeah,
mean, it just makes sense.
extraordinary physique on one hand, extraordinary physique, but better in the strength compartment. So yeah, the choices are, that's what you choose to specialize in. But yeah, so I think that that's a big part of it. How much of it, and people argue about this, I'm
Mhm.
not sure that I could say, but I do think that you could train a lot of bodybuilders like power lifters, and if you could convince power lifters to probably give up on a lot of the dietary things that they don't have,
Yeah.
the bodybuilders worry a lot about that power
Yeah.
lifters don't, then you could begin to get some of the, I'll call it the reverse adaptation, if that's the right way of saying it.
Right, right, right. Cool, cool. So switching topics a little bit, going into even more of your wheelhouse on protein.
Mm,
You and I think I saw more research showing recently that higher doses of protein are fine. And for a long
sure.
time it was like, hey, 5, 6 doses. I mean, back when I was getting into this in like 2000, like 5 and 6, I was eating 7 meals a day. And I remember told the story if I was in high school and I would have
Sure.
2 minutes between classes. So I chugged this big cottage cheese shake and it was just disgusting, like all this stuff because I had to get
Yeah.
that seventh meal in, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
and once I switched to 3 meals, I saw no detriment at all. And
Right.
my personal experience was, hey, I know there's this theoretical limit of how much protein I can take in, but I'm having, and I was eating very high protein back then. So I might be having,
Right.
meal one, 70 grams, meal two, 70 grams, meal
Right.
three,
Right.
80 grams.
Sure.
And it seemed fine. It seems like more research is indicating that that is probably fine.
Yeah. I mean, I think that and this is a hard one to sort of parse out a little bit. There's been a misunderstanding about the messaging of we can eat and digest a lot of protein. Like
Digest, sure. Yeah.
in the study that you're referring to, I think it's the Tromelin, Jorn Tromelin is the first author. And, Jorn's a good friend of mine. He works with Luc Van Loon. I think it was just over there like a week and a half ago for a PhD defense,
Okay.
chatting with both of them. They fed guys 100 grams, and everybody goes, "Oh, look, see, you can digest 100 grams." And well, I don't know about nobody, but I or we never said you couldn't digest more. The question is about how much you can use and how much
Right.
your muscle
Right.
can use. And I think that's the new information. So as we've said before, our work suggested that it was around 30 grams, and then your muscle really couldn't use anything beyond that. And what they showed in their work is that when you fed people 100 grams, that your muscle was still making use of those amino acids much longer. So I think that that's the new information, is that we probably cut the studies off too short early on. And when you take the biopsies to show the incorporation over a longer period of time, larger meals, you can still assimilate and still are assimilating protein for a long period of time. And, one of Jorn's analogies is to say, well, when a boa constrictor swallows a whole pig or something like that. I mean, I don't know what boas eat, but
Yeah.
they swallow something and then they're sitting there and digesting it for a long period of time.
Yeah.
Is that they must be making use of the amino acids, and obviously human beings have maybe not the boa constrictor
Yeah.
capacity, but a much larger capacity than we previously appreciated. So yeah, we probably unwittingly contributed to some of the confusion in that area by talking about the limit, but the limit was never digestion. It was
Right.
always about utilization. And to your point, I think practical experience would say, one, two, maybe not one, but let's say 2 to 3 meals a day, just as good as 5 to 6 meals a day. So yeah, that's a change in the narrative that I would give to athletes about how they should, quote unquote, spread their protein out over the day. Doesn't appear to be as necessary as we once thought.
Yeah, I've anecdotally I've heard a number of people comment on issues with two, and I thought there was some research indicating two being inferior to three. I've kind of always seen like, okay, three is completely fine compared to six. Is what
Yeah.
you've seen showing that even two would be equivalent or just not
You
too much
know,
worse?
I think Eric's done a pretty good job. I want to say Jeff Nipper did a really good video as well. Some of these people are very talented at, conveying the big message. And
Hmm.
big message is get the protein in, and, sort of, let's say 1.6 or whatever. I'll say 1.6. Some people might say higher, but that's the big thing. Could it be one meal a day at 1.6? Inside makes me think, I think you need to divide it up. Could it be two? I think you're doing okay. The question of two versus three, very difficult to show those effects, I think. But three is a pragmatic choice, I think, that most people can get behind and distribute protein, relatively evenly with a little bit of probably choice around what they choose to eat. And definitely, more than three, the evidence gets really thin, and the difference, if it's there at all, at least with nothing that we have available, we detect the difference. But yeah, there may be a difference between 2 to 3. Definitely, I think one, I want to say in my heart of hearts, is not as optimal as 3.
Yeah.
But the big picture is get the protein in. The smaller details within the bigger picture are, divided up and divided evenly. And then everybody, is like, well, what about the leucine content? I'm like, well, if you're getting the 1.6 and it's fairly good quality protein, that's a smaller issue
Yeah.
than people are making out, for
For
sure.
people listening, 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight,
Oh,
right?
sorry. Yeah.
Yeah.
1.6 grams per kilogram body weight per day, or about 0.7 grams per pound.
Yep. And you said maybe your research or the research showing 30 grams, for assimilation. What do you think the flaw in that study was? You said you thought maybe you cut it off too early?
maybe we didn't go high enough, and maybe like we just took the biopsy. We were like, okay, we said after 5 hours, and then we should have taken one that was a little bit later, and showed that the muscle was still assimilating the protein. We had a lot of reasons for doing that at the time, and I'm thinking, again, back to some sort of essential amino acid digestion studies that seem to suggest that, everything kind of stopped after about, the dose at about 30 to 40 grams of protein. It could be that the difference between protein versus essential amino acids, and let's be clear about the Tromelin paper, that's a study in which they fed milk protein, right? So does this happen with real food? We need to test that. But again, the one thing that we continuously see now is that the isolated proteins, we get the amino acids up and down, and sort of relatively rapidly. As soon as you begin to feed people meals, things are much more, I'll call it sluggish with respect to digestion, as you'd expect. So I think that there's a pragmatic message in around, you eat a big meal that contains a lot of protein. It's going to probably be around for several hours. That if you're going to test the hypothesis, you need to begin to extend the time frame over which you would take the biopsies to measure the incorporation. So,
And is that, and I'm just asking because I don't know what the study design was. Was it like, hey, we measure at 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, and we stop at five, or and we saw a downward trend that we assumed it continued like that?
well, they took biopsies until I think it was up as long as 24 hours, and they were showing that even after 12 hours, you were still digesting and using the amino acids from the single large bolus meal, so the 100-gram meal. So,
Right.
once again, I think that that's maybe something that we didn't take into consideration with some of the earlier trials that we
Yeah, yeah.
need to do later and longer
Right.
incorporation times for sure.
And yeah, protein type was the other question I had because I would imagine that it would be quite different if somebody ate, 3 bowls of cottage cheese versus, like a whey isolate. They chugged 100
Yeah,
grams of whey isolate. That would have to be
yeah.
somewhat different.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that there's digestion kinetics. The important part is people talk about fast and slow proteins, and the truth is that the one slow protein that we're aware of is casein,
Right.
or the largest proportion of milk protein that's out there. Cottage cheese is a popular source, but everything else is relatively fast. But those are isolated protein sources. As soon as you put it in a food matrix, everything becomes much slower. So we were looking at some of our data recently on a trial that we were just completing the analysis on, where we compared, meal responses. And some of these meal responses are extraordinarily, first, they're small, and they take a long time. And that's just the food matrix effect. And so some of these studies now, we need to begin to, tackle that question and not the isolated protein,
Yeah.
I think, to be able to give us a definitive answer. Tough studies to do, though. They cost a lot of money,
Yeah.
unfortunately. And then everybody wants to know, well, what happens over the long term? And I'm like, well,
Yeah. Good luck.
training studies and, getting people to just eat, one meal versus 3 meals or something.
Yeah.
Not easy. Let's put
No,
it that
no.
way.
So if you were to have a spectrum from like whey isolate to casein, something like even a beef protein would be much closer to whey then in terms of speed of digestion.
Beef would be so as a cooked food is actually, it's a little bit slower than milk protein, only because of the food matrix. But isolated proteins, I'm talking like everything is either fast or casein, and
Okay.
there's really no protein in the middle that sort of is, I'll call it medium or something like that. Some people say soy, and I'm like, it's a pretty fast digested protein. Whey's the fastest, no
Yeah.
question, but everything is varying degrees of rapid. As soon as you get into foods, things change. Just about everything slows down as a food compared to the isolated protein
Sure.
source.
Well, I guess I meant like, yeah, like certainly if you had a steak and there's fat in there and everything, that's slower. But if you're, I'm saying like a beef protein isolate, like powder, that
Yeah,
would still be pretty fast.
that's you're bringing me back to my early days of Joe Weider's
Yeah,
protein
yeah,
supplements. It was either egg or beef.
yeah, yeah.
you plugged your nose and you just drank that stuff.
Yeah, I've got some. It's not good.
Yeah, it's got a certain taste. Yeah, it's relatively rapid.
Okay.
Funny enough, like again, it's all defatted and everything else like that, but it's much more whey-like than it is casein. Like casein, as soon as you drop it as a protein into acid, it clots. And that slows down the digestion. Well, first it slows down gastric emptying, and then it slows down the digestion as well.
Gotcha. Okay. I believe it was Don Layman. I heard it might have been on Peter Tia's podcast, and he was talking, and this probably just falls in line with the same idea. He was saying how,
Mhm.
if you're going to have 3 meals a day, he thinks the first and the third are the ones that really should be the bigger protein sources. The middle one, like, fine. I guess that more or less just ties into the same reasoning, right? That those ones are going to kind of get you. The first one's going to get you all the way to the third one, and the third one's going to get you to the first one. Like, same logic, basically.
Absolutely. Yeah. Don, I learned something from Don every time I chat with him. But yeah, he's of the opinion that that first meal, in particular, when you break your fast, is a sort of, I'll call it a patterning meal for lack of a better word, maybe. But yeah, it sets the tone. So if that's a small protein containing meal, you just get that little anabolic bump. You've done yourself a quote unquote a disservice by not getting a full and robust anabolic response. So you need to emphasize protein at that first meal, and then to his point about the last meal, it's that's the one that's got to sort of tide you over during the overnight fast to get to your first meal again the next morning.
Right, right. Okay. And I guess, you made the comment earlier about leucine. And obviously at this point, I think most people understand, like, supplementing with branched chain amino acids more or less useless. And would you say that there's any, other than convenience of, let's say, a whey shake, are there any protein or amino acid supplementation regimens that are worth anything to somebody trying to maintain or gain more muscle? Or is it basically just convenience and eat your meals?
Yeah, I mean, leucine matters to the extent that I think as you get older, and you begin to eat less, and your appetite goes down, and your muscle mass going down, and whatever is responsible for anabolic resistance, likely a confluence of a lot of factors. Maybe leucine does become a bigger issue. My first line advice would be to try and pick proteins that are higher quality, with an emphasis again on leucine. The reason, and people ask why I basically crap on branch chains as much as I do, is that they all compete for the same transporter. So if you have all the other branch chains in similar ratios as you do to leucine, then isoleucine and valine diminish the effectiveness of leucine because they compete for the same basically transporters that it's using to get into the bloodstream, into the muscle and everything else. So it's not to say that don't take branch chains, but there's only one amino acid out of the branch chains, one branch chain that's effective, and that's leucine. So
Yeah, yeah.
now I'm always a protein first type of person and emphasize the quality of the protein. So milk proteins, they're the best, nature best sources of leucine and all of the other essential amino acids that we have. I don't know that there's anything else that I would, sort of, beat the drum for in terms of individual amino acids or supplements. I do think that convenience is the biggest thing that they offer, which is why a lot of athletes use them, obviously. But a diet first approach and getting them from dietary sources, I think, is, you really can't beat it. Nothing that we've had to date shows us that the individual, like supplementation with leucine as an example, is going to give you some sort of drastic advantage over just doing it with dietary sources. But as you get older, that becomes a tougher proposition. I'll definitely agree to that.
Is there any, outside of just hypertrophy, is there any utilization to supplementing certain amino acids for any other reason? I know some people say, well, take something this before going to bed or anything like that that you find worthwhile.
Yeah. I mean, there's been a lot of talk around arginine and wound healing and immune function. Uh, I call it relatively gray in terms
Hmm.
of the evidence there. Some people talk about glutamine, some people talk about other, even non-essentials in, supporting collagen synthesis or something like that. And I think it's pretty thin evidence. I'll be honest. There's nothing out there that makes me so convinced that I'm like, okay, well, I should definitely try and get this in your diet over and above just making some pretty, I'll call it judicious choices around the foods that you eat.
Okay. Well, you just mentioned collagen, and that was going to be my next question. So I won't tell the whole story, but I on a recent podcast, I was talking about how I kind of accidentally was sent like 20 pounds of hydrolyzed collagen
Oh,
supplementation.
wow.
So I've got that. And
Yeah.
it's always talked about as like, very low quality protein.
Mhm.
Um, I've seen and heard some mixed reviews and like research on it for skin health,
Yeah.
how some of it's questionable, but some of it's decent evidence. So I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on that, and I'm hoping you're going to tell me there's some use of this 20 pounds I got.
So I'll start out with the tissue I know best, and that's muscle. All I can say is that, like, unequivocally, and a lot of this work comes from Luke Van Loon's group as well, who is doing some outstanding work in this area. Is that there's nothing that I've seen that makes me think that supplementing with collagen does anything for collagenous tissue and muscle. And there is obviously collagen in muscle. I mean, these are the collagenous fibers that eventually taper off at the end of the muscle and form a tendon. Um, yeah, so nothing from a muscle standpoint
Right.
in that front. A few interesting studies with, I'll call it some training effects that if they result in some of the increases in muscle fiber size that are reported in the papers, my question is always why people don't get appropriately then stronger. If you believe that, strength is a function of muscle cross-sectional area. So,
So in those studies, they showed some muscle growth, but basically no
yeah,
strength, is what you're saying?
yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. So I guess you could say, well, maybe it's sarcoplasmic hypertrophy or
Right, right.
I'm being facetious, but I mean,
Yeah.
so I'm always a little bit wary of because all of the imaging methods and even when you're taking biopsies, the analysis is subject to maybe having water retention or some sort of changes in the hydration status of the tissue that could be responsible for that. But if you are creating greater hypertrophy, it's not translating into greater strength. So I think we can all just cross muscle off as a tissue that benefits from that. Skin, I don't know enough to say.
Okay.
Again, robust meta-analyses suggest that there's an effect with collagen supplementation, and this is like sort of skin elasticity and a few other things around indices of wrinkling that there could be benefits. I think for me to truly convince me, and people talk about connective tissue as well. So obviously cartilage, regradative tendons, and everything like that were, benefit like receiving some benefit. My question is if that's true, and all of the beautifying effects of this, then there should be some objective, like i.e. non-industry sponsored randomized control trial to show this. And collagen has been around long enough now, and we just don't have those data.
Yeah.
So I'm a little bit skeptical that they exist. Most of the work on skin is sponsored by collagen industry people, and so you kind of have to squint a little bit. I do have a good friend. I saw him. He's over in Luke's lab in Keith Bar. Keith is, I think, coming around to the idea that it's the loading of tendons, as an example, that's the key part, like it is with muscle, of their regeneration and repair. The collagen, if it does add as a supplement, and he recommends taking it before exercise, it's a relatively thin layer to the repair and regeneration of cartilaginous tissue like tendons and ligaments and that sort of thing. But he does have some impressive case studies that
Hmm.
he's shown me with athletes, and I'll call them high value athletes, um, experiencing some extraordinary, say, regenerative capacity in tissue that normally doesn't regenerate very quickly. And the main reason why connective tissue just doesn't regenerate like soft tissue, like muscle, it's just a ridiculously poor blood supply.
Right.
It's not highly vascularized. And so, Keith makes the point that you need to get substrates like all of the non-essential amino acids in circulation before the tissue is loaded, as opposed to after. He says that, and he is of the opinion that there's an effect, but he would also, I think, say that it's a relatively small effect. The loading is what really does the job.
That's interesting. So, I mean, I do take mine before my workout. What I've done is
Yeah.
basically, because I'm usually having about 200 grams of protein a day. So,
Sure.
I figure, hey, it's probably more than I need. So if I replace 20 grams of something else with, 15, 20 grams of collagen, like it's not hurting anything. I might as well
Yeah,
use it.
right. Yeah,
Um,
right. I mean, and I think that that's where I sort of, I come back and people say, well, but, and I'm like, okay, well, look, first, if you happen to get like a 20 pound, 20 kilo, I don't know, if you've got 20 kilos,
yeah,
40
20
odd
pounds.
pounds,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
so 20 pounds, you get 20 pounds of hydrolyzed collagen, then yeah, absolutely, like take it and see what happens, right? It's a pretty, decent cost proposition, low risk, could have some benefits. Somebody who has knee issues from a, stupidity of doing too many dumb things when he was younger, I'd love to, experience some robust benefit of collagen supplementation. And I've done the AB N=1 experiment, and I've yet to have this epiphany moment where I've been like, collagen has made a big difference for me. So that's just my N of one. So
Yeah.
maybe that's why I'm so jaded.
Right,
But
right, right.
other people tell me, they go, oh, it was a game changer. And I'm like, okay, well, that's great. Good for you. Again, coming back to what's out there, relatively small effects. And if it were truly for something like, let's say, knee OA, right? I mean, how many millions of people globally have mobility issues because of knee osteoarthritis? If it really were effective, why haven't we had a multi-center randomized controlled trial on the supplement itself showing that it's effective? So
Right,
I'll
right.
just leave it at that.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's always tough because I try not to go by anecdote too much, but at some point, if there's so much anecdote, you gotta wonder.
Sure.
And I'll see on collagen videos and whatnot. There's I don't know if you know Nick Verhoeven. I just
Yeah.
discovered him recently, but very smart guy, and he's talked about collagen on this channel a number of times. And on the comments, you'll see all these people saying, I noticed either skin changes or just like, tendon changes as far as feeling a lot better.
Yeah.
Obviously, I'm sure you could also go on to like a Kim Kardashian video and say, oh, this like facial thing like was so beneficial. And who really knows, right? I mean, what's the anecdote coming from?
Yeah. Yeah.
But you do certainly hear a lot of anecdote on it. I'm curious about the person you mentioned. So he felt like collagen specifically was helpful before a workout. Is that based on anything, or are you just theorizing?
Oh, it's based on the idea that, I mean, so mechanical tension sets off a series of proteins in the cell. We call them mechanical mechanosensors or mechanical transducers that induce all of the changes and adaptations, fairly well characterized in muscle tissue. The anabolic response that's set up as a result of that mechanical tension then manifests itself for hours after exercise or loading. And muscle is highly vascularized, so you can provide the protein afterwards. You can get the amino acids to the muscle itself, and then you can get the anabolic response. The difference is that the mechanical response in fibroblast cells that are part of the connective tissue is much more transient for, again, reasons Keith could give you a better explanation than I could, but let's just say it's sort of like on and then it turns off. And the connective tissue is not vascularized like muscle. So you put the substrate in, which are the non-essential amino acids coming from the collagen, before you exercise. And so it's up at a certain time. And then after or after you've had this mechanical stimulus, the tissues and the cells make use of it. So it's a difference in timing only because of the amount of blood flow and the mechanical response that the cells that make up the connective tissue as opposed to the muscle actually give you. So you just need to get one on board before you do it so you can take advantage of that anabolic window that we've talked about, but that's
Right, right.
open a long time in muscle, but that's very, very short for connective tissue.
Mm.
So it's yeah, that's why he talks about the timing. So I don't think it's theoretical as much as it is just what we know about the biology of mechanically responsive connective tissues.
Yeah, that's really interesting actually, because it's become almost like a meme at this point of like, oh, this anabolic window, I got to drink my protein shake on the way home from the gym, right? And like that's like it's almost
Yeah,
laughed at now, even though it used to be considered so true. But
yeah.
you're saying it actually it could be the case for maybe like a connective tissue that you would have quite a bit of a smaller window.
Yeah, and I think if you were to talk to Keith, like he would definitely subscribe to that. Is the
Mm.
anabolic window in connective tissue is ridiculously short, and because of the poor blood flow that the tissue gets, it's also probably quite limited, right? So
Yeah, yeah.
that's his take on things. But again, just taking collagen as a supplement doesn't do anything in the absence of loading. It's the loading that sort of turns on all of the anabolic processes, and that's the mechanical sensitivity that the tissue has that allows it to make use of the substrate, which is the hydrolyzed collagen that you've ingested. I mean, the other thing too is to remember is that collagen is not also only made up exclusively of non-essentials, right? It's made up of essential amino acids as well. So, again, I point out to people, like, if you're stuck on a desert island and you just had collagen as a protein source, you'd be dead, like, because it
Yeah,
doesn't have one essential amino acids. It'd take a long time, but you'd eventually you not be in good shape.
yeah,
So
yeah, yeah, right.
yeah,
You mentioned that there's actually robust meta-analyses on it, which I guess I was surprised to hear about, only in the sense of I was thinking of the quality. I suppose you can have a robust meta-analyses of maybe not the most quality studies. Is that basically it, or is it just because they're
sure. Yeah,
funded, right?
well, I mean that a good meta-analysis doesn't just put the data in and look at what happens, but does an evaluation of the quality of the studies that go in there. Now, there are probably, at last count, like, I mean, 20 ways of evaluating study quality going in and going out. Not all of them good, in my opinion. The best is usually through a system called grade. The other way that you can look at this is that the off-the-cuff estimate is that unless you're comparing at least 400 individuals in one condition to 400 individuals in another condition, nobody should be doing a meta-analysis. Like, it's just there's too few people to really get a robust answer. So I see meta-analyses done with a lot less than 400 and 400 in each group. And that always makes me think, well, I don't really give a lot of stock to
Yeah,
things that are done in that fashion. So yeah, there is always the garbage in, garbage out. So,
right.
but there should be, if the meta-analysis is robust, an estimation of the certainty of the effect and the quality of the studies that go into estimating that certainty or uncertainty with that effect. It's
Yeah.
not often done, or it's done, but I think not often done well, unfortunately. So people need to, yeah, begin to read these with a little bit deeper detail than they currently are, I think.
Yeah, it's got to be tough though with skincare studies, because we talk in the fitness industry of like, hey, well, this isn't cancer research, so it's hard to fund studies for muscle growth, right? That's like something that's commonly talked about, which is true. But even
Yes.
then, you could say, okay, but there are health reasons for muscle growth, and got to
Sure.
avoid sarcopenia. Like you could see where funding could maybe come from. But for something like how your skin looks, I mean, who's going to fund that outside of a skincare company? I can't
Well,
imagine.
Yeah, no, you make a great point, and look, I do know one company that has supplements that cross the borders between muscle effects and skin effects, and the one guy that's involved in the science of that said, well, if you think that the supplement industry is sort of the maybe a little bit shady than the skin and cosmetic industry. It's the Wild West. You like
Totally.
claims are just like all over the place, right? So
Yeah.
yeah, like so not to be again overly critical or jaded, but beautification, beauty is in the eye of the beholder is truly because a lot of these things are subjectively evaluated as well. And not to say that skin elasticity and all of these things can't be objectively tested, but they're yeah, as you say in the comments section, my skin looks great. I'm like, well, some days I look and I mean, I don't really look
Yeah.
too hard because, but I think,
Yeah.
oh, man, look, I'm looking great today. But I swear it's probably because I got a decent night's sleep as opposed to some cream or something.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. Yeah.
I get it. It's not my stock and trade, so I don't want to I don't want to be overly critical. But
Sure.
some people report some extraordinary outcomes. I just yeah, like I haven't personally seen anything that makes me go, oh, this is a must-have on my supplement shelf. Let's put it
Yeah.
that way.
Yeah.
Other people differ.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Um, so, and like the last thing on that is to say, I know when we talk about, let's say somebody's doing a vegan diet or having that slightly lower quality protein,
right.
we'll say, well, does it matter? Because as long as you're getting sufficient protein and whatnot. And I just
Mm,
want my initial thought on the collagen thing is, would that still apply? Because if you're eating, like you could see an example analogous to the vegan thing, where it's like, hey, if you're getting 50 grams of protein a day and you add 20 grams of collagen, that's going to help versus if you're having 200 grams of protein and you add 20 grams of collagen, maybe it doesn't because you already have sufficient amino
absolutely.
acids.
Yeah.
Um, the only counter argument I could see to that, though, is I have heard some people say it's in the case of collagen, it is not about just the amino acids individually, but
Mm,
di and tripeptides having their own function. So you're already shaking your head. So I'm just,
yeah,
I've
I just
heard this, but
once again, show me that the di and tripeptides show up in circulation in appreciable quantities, and then they begin to trigger processes. So, to your point, exactly. It's not just individual amino acids. There apparently are these, small peptide sequences that could have the effect. You need to show me that they robustly that they show up and they show up repeatedly and in the quantities that they would have a biological effect. So I haven't seen those data. And, that's not to say that, if you drop di and tripeptides that are predicted to exist as a result of digestion of collagen on, chondrocytes or fibroblasts in culture that you couldn't get effects. But that's a far cry from what
mm,
happens biologically in vivo. So I'm just a little, skeptical on that as a potential mechanism. They had the same argument around digestion of whey protein and that there were certain short peptides that had ACE-like activity and lower blood pressure. Just people looked, and maybe the technology is better now. We have lot better mass specs. Um, just show me that they show up and that they're measurable. I know people are trying,
mm.
and so let's just say when those data come out and you can show me that happens, then I'll definitely buy into it for sure.
I always try to make a distinction to the audience, but also for myself of the difference between, hey, we have data against this thing versus we just
Okay.
don't have that data yet. Is this a
Right.
situation where you just think we don't have the data yet, but you're open to it, or you think we've shown that it's really
Oh,
not?
I know I'm 100% open to it if you can show me that it happens. Like, so we
Mhm.
don't have the data yet. I don't think we have data that says that's opposite to that.
Okay.
Definitely in vitro, so in a dish, in basically cells, you can show effects that would suggest that if underscore if this were occurring in vivo inside a person, that we could have that kind of effect. The system gets much more complicated in vivo, obviously, than cells in a
Sure.
dish. So, you have to go, okay, but first just show me that these short peptides show up and survive passage across the enterocyte, so the intestine, and they show up in circulation, and that once they're in circulation, that they have some type of impact. So first, just show me that they show up.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I'd start with that. And again, just people are like, oh, well, there's this study and everything, and you go and you look at it, and it's an abstract in a journal, and I'm like, I can't see the data. I just don't see it. So, um,
Gotcha.
I'm open. I'm always
Yeah.
open. I need some convincing.
Right, right. And so if it turned out that that was not, it just came down to the amino acids, would you then go back to what I was saying, where, hey, if you are already getting sufficient protein intake, you think the potential effect would just be less in general?
Well, one of the things that the people maybe have lost sight of is that these are a lot of the amino acids in collagen and in the collagen protein itself are non-essential. So as the name implies, basically we call them dispensable amino acids. So we make them. The argument has been is that you can't make them in sufficient quantities to give it to the tissue to sort of optimize its function. And you got to go back a long way. And these experiments have been done in the 60s and 70s, looking at what we call non-essential or dispensable amino acids, and look at rates of whole body protein synthesis and rates of tissue protein synthesis and lots of things. And it's really hard to find data to show that these amino acids, even if they're present, would have some effect. So I think when you look at the protein intake as a whole, you're probably getting a lot of these non-essentials anyway, in terms of the protein that you're ingesting. Your body's making them. So it's really then becomes difficult for me to think that, increasing the source of these non-essentials, specifically through proteins like collagen, it could exert some type of biological effect. But again, lots of noise and hand waving and sort of quasi, I'll call it plausible data. And people saying anecdotally they feel like this. And I'm like, okay, well, add it all up and let's do something that's robust. Like if I were a company and I were making collagen, I would sink some money into doing some pretty large, robust trials. But I'm a scientist and I'm not a marketing guy. And as I've
Right.
been told by a few supplement people, doing that just isn't good business. And I'm
Sure,
like, well, it's
sure.
good science, but it's
Yeah.
not good business because it could work out that it doesn't work.
Yeah. And then what do you do? Then
So
you're really stuck.
again,
So
not to be overly jaded, but that's kind of my take on it.
sure, sure. Cool. All right. Well, we're coming up on time. Thank you very much, Stu, for taking the time to go into all this stuff. Sometimes I'm like, do I want to go into the details? You're the exact guy I'd want to go into the details with. So thank you for nerding out.
Thanks, Dave. I appreciate you having me on the show.
Yeah. And just real quick, where can people find more of your work?
I am MacKinProf, MacKinProf on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. I'm horrendous on TikTok though, but I got on there just to really rile my youngest son up, who said that
Okay.
old people ruin TikTok. So I'm ruining TikTok one old
Perfect.
person at a time. So
Perfect. Cool, cool. All right. Thanks again, man.
my pleasure. Thanks, Dave.